In his landmark paper, Princeton philosopher Harry Frankfurt laments the ubiquity of bullshit. One of the most salient features of our culture, he says, is that there is so much bullshit. And then he spends the rest of his paper explaining exactly what he thinks bullshit is. So what is bullshit? According to Frankfurt, it's something like lying, but it's not quite the same. Whereas the liar believes that what she says to be false, the bullshitter, on the other hand, is just simply not concerned with the truth of what she says. So bullshit, according to Frankfurt, is marked by its indifference to the truth. Now, since Frankfurt did propose the first philosophical theory of bullshit, there have been other accounts offered. Most notably, Gerald Cohen, in his paper, Deeper into Bullshit, he offers a theory that focuses on a specific kind of postmodern bullshit that pervades the academy. He thinks that, for example, French philosophy is full of this kind of impenetrable, jargon-laden bullshit. So like me, Cohen claims that indifference to the truth cannot be the hallmark of bullshit, because these academics who write these bullshit papers are not trying to be dishonest or deceived. They write their bullshit papers in complete earnest. Instead, Cohen defines bullshit as, quote, a species of nonsense. It just doesn't make sense. Now, I think both of these theories get something right about bullshit, but my contention is that each of their theories are too narrowly focused on a very specific kind of bullshit, so they fail to capture what makes bullshit bullshit. So my goal in this talk is to develop a broader theory of bullshit, one that describes a wider phenomenon that captures more of what we call bullshit in discourse and beyond. You could call it a unified theory of bullshit if you like, but that would be a really bullshit kind of title. So I had a moment of realization when a local musician I had a lot of respect for paid me a compliment about something I'd written in my little blog that I thought nobody actually reads. I was writing about a music gig, and he was saying that so often when he reads music reviews, it's like the person wasn't at the event or didn't hear the music that was actually played. And the compliment he paid me was that I really captured something about the concert that I had written about, and he thought that it was clear that I'd really been paying attention, and he liked that I'd written about it. So when he told me this, when I got this unexpected compliment, my first thought was, oh, so what I'd written was not bullshit? Because that's what I was really worried about. I'm not a musician. I wasn't trying to write bullshit, quite the opposite, but my fear was, nevertheless, that when I wrote about music, I was bullshitting. So I had this insight. Sometimes bullshitters don't intend to bullshit. Sometimes they don't even know that they're bullshitting. So indifference to the truth cannot be an essential quality of bullshit like Frankfurt claims. This is what Cohen gets right about bullshit. It can be done in earnest. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that bullshitters never intend to bullshit. Clearly they do, but sometimes also people bullshit and they just don't know that they're doing it. So even if you're one of those people who's completely confident that you know when you're bullshitting, you still have to admit that there are times when you think there are others who are bullshitting and they don't know that they're doing it. So we're in Northern California. We all know people who believe some of this bullshit. And they believe it in earnest, too. In the debate about vaccines, you're going to find the charge of bullshit a lot. Here's a Gawker article. This is reporting that a paper that The Lancet published in 1998 on the causes of autism was retracted because the doctor who conducted the research was paid, so they say, to fake the study linking MMR vaccines to autism. So despite the fact that this paper was retracted and the study discredited, a lot of people Gawker reports, follow the Dr. Wakefield and subscribe to his bullshit. Now, unsurprisingly, the top comment in this discussion says that the article itself, of course, is complete bullshit. The point is, regardless of which side of the debate you come down on, when you call the other side's views bullshit, you do that knowing that many of the people who put forward the bullshit claims are not trying to bullshit. If you think about the parents on either side of this vaccine debate, they sincerely believe whatever bullshit they believe, and they're just trying to do the right thing by their children. Which is not to say that others aren't fully aware of their own bullshit. These big money politicians are all pro-GMO publicly, but what about the food they eat at home? Politicians, as we know, are always full of bullshit. It doesn't really matter what the issue is. Some of them might believe their own bullshit, but probably most of them know full well that they're bullshitting. Now, you may not agree with me on what specific things I'm calling bullshit, but that doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to articulate what the concept is, even if we disagree on how to apply it in specific cases. So just like we could agree on what the words funny or clever or boring mean, we might still disagree on what things we call funny, clever, or boring. And this is true for pretty much any concept. We might agree on what the concept means, but disagree sometimes on how to apply it. Now, these insights about bullshit led me to articulate some requirements on a new theory of bullshit, a theory that captures the various ways that we actually use the term. So the first thing, it should include the possibility of unintended bullshit. It should capture both sincere and insincere instances of bullshit. It should apply regardless of the bullshitter's attitude to the bullshit. And then the last requirement, it should identify what is common to both discursive and non-discursive bullshit. So what is discursive bullshit? Basically, anytime you've been in a conversation and someone has said something that you think is bullshit, or you've read an article and you think that's bullshit, this is paradigm case of discursive bullshit. It's basically bullshit that is spoken or written. This kind of bullshit involves putting forth claims or assertions that can be evaluated in various ways. And I'll say a little bit more about that later, but let's start with some examples of discursive bullshit from the news. This is from Tech Dirt from this month. And it's Verizon picks the worst possible person to try to bullshit into unnecessary upgrade. Imagine bullshit from a sales representative. Another flimsy justification for mass surveillance bites the dust. Now note, this example claims that the justification, in other words, the argument put forth in court for mass surveillance is bullshit. And that's what makes this an example of discursive bullshit. It's bullshit that is written or spoken. But it's not the only kind of bullshit that there is. If you think that mass surveillance in itself, in other words, the practice of collecting data on everyone in the country, if you think that program is bullshit, then that's something different. And that's because some bullshit is enacted or performed. It's executed in deeds or actions, or it's instituted in rules or laws. So let's call that enacted bullshit, or bullshit that is performed or instituted. Now, enacted bullshit may have elements of discursive bullshit, meaning that part of how the bullshit is performed might involve someone making some bullshit claims. But there's more to it than that. That can't exhaust it. There has to be some kind of action involved, too. So to illustrate the concept further, here's one of my favorite examples of what I consider to be enacted bullshit, or bullshit that is performed, not merely spoken. So this was a checklist from the TSA on their controversial SPOT program, which is screening of passengers by observation techniques. So this was a program that they used to identify potential terrorists in security lines in the airport based on behaviors that are actually very, very common amongst all travelers. And I don't know if you can read this little subtitle here, but a quote from the manager who leaked this document to The Intercept, who's the first one to publish it, says, "The SPOT program is bullshit. Complete bullshit." Now, why do I call this enacted bullshit? You might think that rules are something that are spoken or written. So if you think of this TSA security checklist, this was presumably written down, it was communicated verbally. So yes, it does have a discursive element, but rules are also performed in action. They are enforced. So if we think about rules, there's very real consequences when rules are instituted. They affect what we can do and how we can do it. So this is why I think this is an example of enacted bullshit. And here's my way of saying in action that I think airport security rules are bullshit. That's me at the Portland airport getting a pat down and giving the finger to the whole thing. Here's another example of enacted bullshit from the recent news. This is from Mother Jones. So in this case, the bullshit nail salon workers have to put up with are their work conditions, how much they get paid for what they do, and what they're expected to do. So the problem with Frankfurt's theory of bullshit is that it's too narrowly focused on a specific kind of discursive bullshit. It fails to see that there are these two broad but distinct categories of bullshit, discursive and enactive. So having looked at these two categories, I now want to say what I think is common to both. So let's look again at what our new theory of bullshit should do. To identify what's common to both, I want to start with discursive bullshit. I want to give an account of what that is first, and then I want to see if we can extend that account to include enacted bullshit and say what the two kinds of bullshit have in common. So the key claim I want to make is that an assertion is bullshit when it lacks epistemic warrant. Now, epistemic warrant, this is a common term from epistemology, excuse me, or theory of knowledge, and specifically from a branch of epistemology called theory of justification. Different philosophers defend competing theories of epistemic warrant, or of what justifies a claim, or what entitles someone to a belief. But the theory of bullshit that I'm offering here is neutral with respect to these different theories of justification. So I want to use the epistemic warrant in the broadest, most inclusive way. So to say that an assertion is bullshit when it lacks epistemic warrant is just a fancy bullshit way of saying something like, the person doesn't know what they're talking about. They're just bullshitting. And when someone bullshits, it could be for a wide variety of reasons. In other words, there are many ways to bullshit. So something might be bullshit because it depends on faulty reasoning or an unreliable method. So when Gawker in the anti-vaccination, when they talk about the anti-vaccination camp, they talk about anti-science groupthink. So that kind of groupthink is not a good way of coming to beliefs. It could be because of ignorance or lack of expertise. So when I was worried about bullshitting when I was writing about music, this was my fear. Who am I? I don't know much about music. I shouldn't be writing about it. It could be because of implausible or weak evidence. So think back to the slide on pseudoscience and Himalayan salt lamps. What's the evidence that they actually are good for your health? Also, if you think of some conspiracy theories, they probably fall into this category of bullshit too. It could be because of an unreliable source of information. Oh, you heard that on Fox News? Or, that's a discredited study. That's not a good source of information. It could be because of a disregard for logic, clarity, or coherence. So this includes, but is certainly not limited to, the kind of postmodern academic bullshit that Cohen tries to capture in his essay, and which I hope is not what I'm doing right now. And then finally, there is because of insincerity or indifference to the truth, which is the kind of bullshit that Frankfurt is worried about. But as you can see, it's just one kind of bullshit. And this is the kind of bullshit that we see a lot in the realms of advertising, public relations, and politics. Now, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of the various ways your beliefs can go wrong and end up being bullshit. But it's supposed to highlight both the plurality of the various kinds of bullshit and also the unity within that plurality of bullshit. So that's my account of discursive bullshit. Let's see if we can extend that now to enacted bullshit. Do the two categories of bullshit have some essential feature in common? So this is what I think is essential for both categories of bullshit. There's a lack of some kind of warrant. Bullshit, whether spoken or performed, is bullshit because it's not justified in some way. In other words, there's a gap between what is asserted or enacted on the one hand and what would genuinely justify that assertion or action on the other. Now, I use the word genuinely to highlight the fact that the bullshitter might think that the assertion is justified, but that doesn't preclude the possibility that what is asserted is still bullshit. So as we've said, in discursive bullshit, it's lack of epistemic, specifically epistemic warrant, and we just looked at some of the various ways in which someone's utterance or assertion might lack this kind of warrant. What about enacted bullshit? Is there a similar gap at work here? So let's return to some of our earlier examples. Airport security. Why is that bullshit? Well, where do I begin? There's all sorts of reasons for saying why that's bullshit. Here's one kind of general thing we might say about it. There's a gap between the stated goal of the security program to keep us safe and the instituted rules of the program, many of which, I'm going to say, do absolutely nothing to keep us safe, even if some people find the security theater reassuring in some way when they're traveling. So if the goal of the program doesn't justify what happens on the ground, that means it lacks warrant. So the goal of wanting to keep us safe, for example, doesn't warrant the practice of making passengers remove their shoes. How does that keep us safe? I don't know. Forbidding lighters or shampoo bottles of a certain size. I always think if someone has a lighter, they're going to go, I'm going to singe this furniture with my lighter. I mean, I'm not sure what that's about. Or if you go back to this TSA checklist, searching people who yawn too much, who stare too widely, who gaze down at the ground, or who whistle in the security line. So don't do any of these things when you're in the airport security line, or you might be pulled aside and taken for a terrorist. What about the nail salon workers? So I think the point of the Mother Jones article I showed you is basically this. Your desire for a cheap mani-pedi doesn't warrant the low wages, the racism, and sometimes even the physical abuse that is a reality for many of these nail salon workers. That's why these conditions, these working conditions for the nail salon workers are bullshit. Now, unfortunately, I don't have more time to flesh out this part of the theory, but I invite you to consider your own cases of what I'm calling enacted bullshit and see if it fits with the proposal that I'm making, which is namely that what this kind of bullshit has in common with discursive bullshit is that it lacks a certain kind of warrant. And lastly, before I go, I wanted to let everyone know about the next episode of Philosophy Talk that we're recording this Friday on the Stanford campus. There's no more tickets left. It's sold out in less than 2 hours, and we have a very long wait list, but we are going to be doing live streaming of the event. So if you go to our webpage, philosophytalk.org, you can get the link there on Friday morning for live streaming and see our conversation with Edward Snowden. Thank you.